Blood trickled down Grace O'Connor's palm where her nails had dug into flesh, her gaze fixed on her uncle as he counted the stack of bills with greedy fingers. The man standing beside him, tall, broad-shouldered, with a silver mustache that twitched when he smiled, had just purchased her for $500. "You can't do this," Grace whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "I'm not cattle to be sold." Uncle Vernon didn't even look up from his counting. "Your pa's been dead 3 months, girl. Who'd you think was paying for your keep? You're 19 now, time to earn your way." The year was 1876, and in the dusty town of Copper Ridge, Montana Territory, Grace had just learned how little her freedom was worth. $500, not even enough to buy a decent plot of land. "She's a pretty one," the silver-mustached man, Mr. Hollister, a wealthy rancher from the next county, remarked, eyeing Grace like he might a prized mare. "Got some fire in her, too. I like that." Grace shuddered. She'd heard stories about Hollister's 3 previous wives, all dead before their 30th birthdays. "Deal's done," Uncle Vernon said, tucking the money into his vest pocket. "She's yours come sundown. Take her to the church first if you want to make it proper, but that's your business." The air in the cramped room of her uncle's cabin grew thick and suffocating. Grace's eyes darted to the door, calculating her chances. Vernon followed her gaze. "Don't even think about it," he warned. "Where would you go? Who'd take you in? You've got no money, no family but me." "I'll get my things," Grace said quietly, needing a moment alone to think, to breathe. Her uncle nodded. "Be quick about it. Mr. Hollister's a busy man." Grace slipped into the small back room she'd occupied since coming to live with her uncle after her parents' death. The room was sparse: a narrow bed, a wooden trunk containing her few possessions, and a small mirror hanging on the wall. She caught her reflection. Green eyes wide with fear, auburn hair hastily pinned up that morning, cheeks flushed with anger and terror. She grabbed her mother's silver hairbrush and the small Bible that had belonged to her father, stuffing them into a cotton sack along with 2 dresses and her only other pair of shoes. There was no use taking much wherever she was going. She didn't plan to stay. When Grace returned to the main room, there was a third man present. He stood with his back to the door, tall and lean, wearing a dust-covered duster and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. His stance was relaxed, but something about the way his hand rested near his holstered pistol suggested coiled readiness. "Well now, what's this?" Uncle Vernon demanded, his brows drawing together in annoyance. The stranger turned slightly, and Grace caught a glimpse of his profile: a straight nose, firm jaw dusted with stubble, and eyes the color of a summer storm. "I heard there was a sale going on," the man said, his voice deep and unhurried. "Thought I might make an offer." Mr. Hollister's mustache twitched with indignation. "Sale's over, cowboy. I've already paid," the stranger nodded thoughtfully. "500, I hear." "That's right," Vernon confirmed, suddenly interested. "You offering more?" "Vernon," Hollister sputtered, "we had a deal." The stranger reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch that clinked when he set it on the table. 600. Grace watched in disbelief as her uncle's eyes lit with greed. Was her fate to be decided by whoever offered the highest sum? She felt sick. "Now hold on," Hollister said, his face reddening. "I'll give 700. The stranger smiled faintly. 8. "You can't possibly have that kind of money," Hollister challenged. In response, the stranger appended the pouch, and gold coins spilled across the rough wooden table. "I believe I do." Uncle Vernon's eyes widened. 800 it is, then. "Wait," Hollister protested. 900, the stranger considered for a moment, then reached into his boot and withdrew a folded document. "I'll offer something more valuable than money." "What's that supposed to mean?" Vernon asked, suspicious now. "Deed to a silver claim up in the Shadow Mountains. It's producing now, worth thousands." Vernon's breath caught. "Let me see that." Grace watched as her uncle examined the paper with shaking hands. She didn't know whether to hope the stranger won this grotesque auction or not. What did he want with her? At least with Hollister, she knew what fate awaited her, grim as it was. "This looks real enough," Vernon muttered, greed overwhelming caution. "It is," the stranger confirmed. "I'll throw in the 800 as well, the claim and the cash for the lady's freedom." Vernon looked up sharply. Her freedom, what are you talking about? I'm bidding for her choice, the stranger clarified, finally turning to look directly at Grace. His eyes were indeed gray, but with flecks of blue that caught the light. If she chooses to leave with me, that's her business. If she'd rather stay or go with this gentleman, he nodded toward Hollister, that's her choice too. For the first time, hope flickered in Grace's chest. But before she could speak, Hollister slammed his fist on the table. This is absurd. We had a deal, Vernon. Vernon looked torn, glancing between the deed and Hollister's rage-contorted face. $1,000, Hollister spat. Final offer. The stranger didn't flinch. The claim and 800, he repeated, and my word that I'll see the lady safely wherever she wants to go. Why? Grace found herself asking. Why would you do this? The stranger's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Because no person should be bought or sold. How very noble, Hollister sneered, but Vernon here needs cash in hand, not promises of silver that might not pan out. The claim's been tested, the stranger countered. There's a report with the deed. Vernon licked his lips, torn between immediate cash and potential riches. How do I know this isn't some swindle? You don't, the stranger admitted. But consider, why would I offer both cash and a claim if it wasn't worth something? A tense silence filled the room as Vernon deliberated, his fingers tracing the edges of the deed. Finally, he nodded. Deal, Vernon. Hollister protested. I said deal, Vernon repeated firmly. The claim and cash outweigh your offer, Hollister. Sorry. Hollister's face darkened with fury. You'll regret this, he promised, then stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Vernon quickly pocketed the coins and folded the deed carefully into his vest. She's all yours, mister. I didn't catch your name. Preston, the stranger said. Preston Oaks. Well, Mr. Oaks, pleasure doing business. Vernon glanced at Grace. Get along now, girl, you belong to him. Preston shook his head. She doesn't belong to anyone. He turned to Grace. Miss, I meant what I said. You're free to go wherever you wish. I'll provide escort if you need it. Grace stood frozen, clutching her small sack of belongings. Freedom dangled before her, unexpected and almost unbelievable. She studied Preston Oaks carefully. There was something about him that inspired trust, a steadiness in his gaze, perhaps, or the quiet confidence in his stance. Why would you help me? She asked again. A shadow passed over his face. Let's just say I know what it means to be valued only for what someone can get from you. Vernon cleared his throat impatiently. This is all very touching, but if you two are leaving, do it now. I've got business to attend to. Preston nodded and gestured toward the door. After you, miss. O'Connor, she supplied. Grace O'Connor. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Copper Ridge. A chestnut mare and a buckskin gelding stood hitched to the post outside Vernon's cabin. Preston led Grace toward them. Can you ride? He asked, untying the horses. Yes, Grace answered. Her father had taught her when she was young. Good, we should put some distance between us and town before nightfall. He glanced toward the saloon where Hollister could be seen through the window, drinking and gesturing angrily. I don't think Mr. Hollister takes rejection well. Grace mounted the buckskin with Preston's assistance, settling into the saddle. Where are we going? That depends, Preston replied, swinging onto the chestnut mare. Where do you want to go? Do you have family elsewhere, friends? Grace hesitated. The truth was, she had nowhere. Her parents had moved west from Boston after their marriage, leaving all family behind. They'd been headed to California when illness took them both, leaving Grace stranded in Montana with an uncle she barely knew. I don't have anyone, she admitted, the words tasting bitter. Preston nodded as if he'd expected this answer. Then I suggest we ride west for now. I know a place we can stop for the night, an old trapper's cabin about 10 miles from here. It's not much, but it's shelter. As they rode out of town, Grace felt eyes on her back but refused to look around. She was leaving Copper Ridge, possibly forever, and couldn't bring herself to care. What lay ahead was uncertain, but it had to be better than what she was leaving behind. They rode in silence as the sun began its descent, painting the vast Montana sky in streaks of orange and pink. The landscape opened up before them, rolling hills dotted with pines giving way to expansive grasslands. In the distance, The jagged peaks of mountains rose like sentinels against the horizon. "Thank you," Grace said finally, breaking the silence, "for what you did back there." Preston glanced at her, then returned his gaze to the trail ahead. "No need for thanks." "There is," she insisted. "You spent a fortune to help a stranger." A faint smile touched his lips. "About that, the silver claim isn't exactly what your uncle thinks it is." Grace tensed. "What do you mean?" "There is silver there, but not much. Enough to make the claim legal, not enough to make anyone rich." He looked at her, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "Your uncle won't discover that for a while, though." Despite everything, Grace found herself smiling. "You tricked him." "I'd call it poetic justice. He was selling something that wasn't his to sell." Preston's expression grew serious. "The money's real enough, though. $800 is a high price, but freedom's worth more." As they rode on, Grace studied Preston Oaks more carefully. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps late 20s. His face was weathered from the sun, but handsome in a rugged way. There was a quietness about him, a self-contained quality that made her curious. "Why did you really help me?" she asked. "The truth this time." Preston was silent for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft against the gathering dusk. 3 years ago, my sister found herself in a situation similar to yours. Her husband died, leaving debts. His business partner offered to take care of her in exchange for— well, you can imagine. She had no choice or thought she didn't." He paused. "By the time I found out and came to help her, she was gone, took her own life rather than submit." Grace's heart constricted. "I'm so sorry." Preston nodded, his jaw tight. "Since then, whenever I hear about a woman being treated like property, I can't stand by and do nothing." "It's not much atonement, but it's something." The honesty of his answer touched Grace deeply. She'd encountered few men in her life who viewed women as more than possessions or burdens. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Continue west, probably. I've been drifting since the war ended." "Thought I might try California eventually." "The war, you fought Union cavalry," he confirmed. "Not something I like to remember." They lapsed into silence again as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The rhythm of the horses' hooves created a soothing cadence that calmed Grace's frayed nerves. For the first time since her parents' deaths, she felt something like peace. As night fell completely, Preston pointed toward a dark shape ahead. "There's the cabin." The trapper's cabin was small and crude, but solidly built of logs with a stone chimney. Inside, it contained a rustic table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot against one wall. A stone fireplace dominated the opposite wall. Preston quickly got a fire going while Grace explored their shelter. A shelf held a few basic supplies: coffee, beans, salt left by the cabin's owner or previous visitors. "Trappers maintain these shelters for anyone in need," Preston explained. "Code of the wilderness. Take what you need, leave what you can for the next person." As the fire's warmth filled the small space, Grace set about preparing a simple meal from the provisions in Preston's saddlebags and the shelf supplies. They ate in companionable silence: beans, jerky, and hard biscuits softened by the bean broth. "You take the cot," Preston said when they'd finished eating. "I'll sleep by the fire." Grace didn't argue, too exhausted from the day's events to protest. She removed her boots and outer dress, keeping on her chemise and petticoat, and lay down on the cot, pulling the rough wool blanket over herself. From her position, she could see Preston spreading his bedroll on the floor near the hearth. He removed his gun, belt, and boots, but kept his clothes on, placing his pistol within easy reach. "Do you expect trouble?" she asked, noticing his precaution. Preston added another log to the fire. "I always expect trouble. It's how I've stayed alive this long. Because of the war." "The war and after." He didn't elaborate, and Grace didn't press. Everyone who had survived the conflict carried their own burdens. "Get some sleep," he advised. "We've got a long ride tomorrow." Grace closed her eyes, but sleep proved elusive. The day's events kept replaying in her mind: her uncle's betrayal, Hollister's leering assessment, and Preston's unexpected intervention. What would have happened if he hadn't appeared? The thought made her shudder. "Mr. Oaks," she called softly into the darkness. "Yes." "Where are we going tomorrow?" There was a pause. There's a town called Silver Creek about 2 days' ride from here. Decent place. You might find work there. The hotel usually needs help. And then you'll leave. The prospect of being alone again filled her with dread, though she tried not to let it show in her voice. If that's what you want, he replied carefully. What if I don't know what I want? The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Then we'll figure it out as we go, Preston finally said. For now, just rest. Surprisingly, Grace found herself comforted by this simple answer. For the first time in months, someone was treating her as a person with choices rather than a problem to be solved. She closed her eyes again, and this time, sleep claimed her quickly. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of movement. Early morning light filtered through the cabin's single window. Preston stood by the fireplace, stirring something in a small pot. Morning, he greeted when he noticed she was awake. Hope you like cornmeal mush, it's about all we've got. Grace sat up, smoothing her hair back from her face. It smells wonderful. They ate quickly, eager to get on the trail. As they prepared to leave, Preston handed Grace a small leather pouch that clinked when she took it. What's this? $50, he said matter-of-factly. It'll give you a start wherever you decide to settle. Grace stared at the pouch, then at Preston. I can't accept this. You can and you will, he insisted. Consider it your rightful inheritance, a fraction of what your uncle got for selling you. Put that way, Grace found she couldn't refuse. She tucked the money into her dress pocket. Thank you. They left the cabin as they'd found it, ready for the next travelers in need of shelter. The morning was clear and cool, promising a pleasant day for riding. They mounted up and continued westward, following a trail that wound through increasingly rugged terrain. As they rode, Grace found herself stealing glances at her companion. In the bright morning light, Preston Oaks was even more handsome than she'd initially realized. His features were strong and defined, his movements confident yet unassuming. He rode as if he'd been born in the saddle, one with his horse in a way that spoke of years of experience. Have you always been a horseman? She asked, curious about his past. Preston nodded. Grew up on a horse farm in Kentucky. My father bred and trained cavalry mounts. A shadow crossed his face. The war took the farm along with most everything else. I'm sorry, Grace said. It was a long time ago. They rode in silence for a while before Grace spoke again. My father was a teacher. Before he decided to go west, he taught mathematics at a school in Boston. My mother thought he was crazy to leave a secure position, but she followed him anyway. Love makes people do impractical things, Preston observed. Yes, Grace agreed, remembering her parents' devotion to each other. They were happy, though, even when things were difficult. They believed California would give them a fresh start. And you, do you believe in fresh starts? The question caught Grace by surprise. I suppose I have to now, she said after consideration. Everything I knew is behind me, Preston nodded, understanding in his eyes. The first year is the hardest. After that, you start building something new. Is that what you did after the war? Tried to, he admitted. Worked as a ranch hand, a scout, even tried mining for a while. Nothing stuck. And now, he shrugged. Now I go where the wind takes me. They continued riding through the morning, stopping briefly at midday to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch of jerky and hard biscuits. As they prepared to mount up again, Preston suddenly went still, his hand moving to his pistol. What is it? Grace asked, alarmed by his sudden tension. Riders, he said quietly, nodding toward a rise about half a mile back. 3 of them, they've been following us since we left the cabin. Grace's heart quickened. Hollister, maybe, get on your horse, but don't rush, act natural. They mounted casually, but as soon as they were in the saddle, Preston led them off the main trail and into a stand of pines. They picked their way through the trees until they reached a narrow stream. We'll ride in the water for a while, Preston explained. It'll make us harder to track. The cold water splashed as their horses stepped carefully along the rocky streambed. They followed the water's course for nearly a mile before Preston guided them out onto a rocky shelf where they wouldn't leave obvious tracks. You think we lost them? Grace asked. Preston surveyed the landscape behind them. For now, but if it is Hollister, he won't give up easily. Men like that don't take kindly to losing what they think is theirs. I was never his, Grace said fiercely. Preston's gaze softened as he looked at her. No, you weren't, but men like Hollister don't understand that women aren't possessions to be bought and sold. They continued riding, taking a more circuitous route than planned, staying alert for any sign of pursuit. The mountains loomed closer now, their peaks still capped with snow despite the summer heat in the valleys. As the sun began to set, Preston led them to another shelter, this one an abandoned line shack, once used by cowboys watching over grazing herds. It was smaller than the trapper's cabin, little more than 4 walls and a roof, but it would provide protection from the elements and any potential threats. While Preston tended to the horses, Grace gathered wood for a fire. The physical work felt good after hours in the saddle, and it gave her time to think. Her situation remained precarious. She was alone in the wilderness with a man she barely knew, being pursued by another man who believed he'd purchased her. Yet strangely, she felt more in control of her destiny than she had in months. Inside the shack, they built a small fire, keeping it low to minimize the chance of the smoke being spotted. They ate another simple meal, and Grace found herself growing accustomed to the routine they were establishing. "Tell me about Silver Creek," she requested as they sat before the fire. "What kind of place is it?" Preston considered the question. "Growing town, not as rough as some. There's a church, a school, decent hotel. The main street even has wooden sidewalks." He smiled slightly. "The sheriff's an honest man, keeps the peace without taking sides in every dispute." "It sounds promising," Grace said, trying to imagine a future there. "It could be a good place for a new start," Preston agreed. "The hotel owner's wife, Mrs. Peterson, is always looking for help. She's a fair employer, treats her girls well." "Have you spent much time there?" Preston nodded. "I winter there sometimes when the trails are too snowed in for travel. I've done odd jobs for folks around town." Grace studied him in the firelight. "You don't strike me as a drifter, Mr. Oaks." "You seem more purposeful." A faint smile touched his lips. "Preston," he corrected, "and maybe I am looking for something, I just haven't found it yet." The intimacy of the small space and the dancing firelight created an atmosphere that encouraged confidences. Grace found herself telling Preston about her childhood in Boston, her father's dreams of a better life in California, and the illness that had claimed both her parents on the journey west. "Uncle Vernon was my father's half-brother," she explained. "They were never close, but he was my only living relative. When my parents died, the town marshal sent word to him. He came and took me back to Copper Ridge." Her voice hardened. "I think he was hoping my parents had money set aside. When he discovered they didn't, he started looking for ways to be rid of me." "And found Hollister," Preston concluded. Grace nodded, hugging her knees to her chest. "Hollister's been widowed 3 times. They say his last wife fell down the stairs, but people whisper that he pushed her." Preston's jaw tightened. "Then we definitely need to make sure he doesn't find you." The way he said, "we" sent a curious warmth through Grace. It had been so long since she'd felt she wasn't alone. As night deepened, they prepared for sleep. The shack had no furniture, so they spread their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire. Grace lay awake longer than she intended, listening to the night sounds and watching the play of firelight on the low ceiling. Across the flames, Preston's breathing had evened out into sleep. She studied his face in repose, noting how much younger he appeared without the vigilance that usually marked his expression. What drove a man to wander as he did? What was he searching for? The questions followed her into dreams. Dawn arrived with a light rain pattering on the shack's roof. They ate a hasty breakfast and set out again, both aware that their pursuers might have closed the distance overnight. The rain was both blessing and curse. It would help obscure their trail, but made travel more difficult. They rode steadily through the morning, the mountains drawing ever closer. By midday, the rain had stopped, and weak sunshine filtered through breaking clouds. They paused on a ridge that offered a clear view of the back trail, scanning for signs of pursuit. "There," Preston said quietly, pointing to a distant movement in the valley they had traversed. 3 riders moving steadily in their direction. "Hollister?" Grace asked, though she already knew the answer. Preston's expression was grim. "Yes, and they're gaining on us." "What do we do?" He considered their options. We're still a day's ride from Silver Creek. If we push hard, we might make it by nightfall, but the horses are tired already. Could we reach someplace else? Another cabin or settlement? Preston shook his head. Nothing between here and Silver Creek except wilderness. He surveyed the landscape ahead. Our best bet is to find a defensible position and wait them out. The gravity of the situation hit Grace fully. They mean to kill you and take me, don't they? Preston didn't soften the truth. Yes, Hollister's not the type to accept defeat. In his mind, he bought you fair and square. Anger flashed through Grace, hot and clarifying. Then we fight. A flicker of surprise crossed Preston's face, followed by approval. Yes, we fight, but on our terms, not theirs. They continued riding, but now Preston led them toward higher ground, seeking the tactical advantage. By late afternoon, they had reached a rocky outcropping that commanded a view of the surrounding area. A natural hollow in the rocks created a sheltered space large enough for them and the horses. We'll make our stand here, Preston decided, dismounting. They'll have to approach from that direction. He pointed to the narrow trail they had ascended, which means they'll be exposed while we have cover. Grace slid from her saddle, legs stiff from the long ride. What can I do? Preston unloaded his rifle from its scabbard and checked the ammunition. Can you shoot? My father taught me with a small rifle, she said. For hunting. He nodded and handed her his revolver. This has more kick than you're used to, but the principle is the same. Only use it if they get past me. The calm way he spoke belied the danger they faced, but Grace appreciated his straightforwardness. He wasn't treating her as a helpless woman, but as a partner in their survival. They secured the horses in the hollow and gathered their supplies, preparing for a siege that might last through the night. Preston positioned himself behind a large boulder that offered a clear view of the trail, his rifle resting on the rock's edge. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they waited in tense silence. Grace found herself studying Preston's profile as he kept watch the strong line of his jaw, the intensity of his gaze. In just 2 days, this man had risked everything for her, a stranger. She wondered what kind of person did such a thing in a world where most looked out only for themselves. They're coming, Preston said softly, interrupting her thoughts. Grace peered around the boulder and saw them 3 riders making their way slowly up the trail. Hollister was in the lead, his silver mustache visible even at this distance. Behind him rode 2 rough-looking men, hired guns, most likely. When I give the word, I want you to call out to them, Preston instructed. Tell them to turn back. Will they listen? The corner of his mouth lifted in a humorless smile. No, but it satisfies the niceties before things get ugly. The riders drew closer, now just 100 yards away. Preston's finger rested lightly beside the trigger of his rifle. Now, he whispered. Grace took a deep breath. That's far enough, Mr. Hollister, she called, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. Turn back now. The 3 riders halted. Hollister shaded his eyes, searching the rocks for the source of the voice. Miss O'Connor, he called back. Is that you? Yes. Please turn around and go back to Copper Ridge. There's nothing for you here. Hollister chuckled, the sound unnervingly casual. Now, that's where you're wrong, Miss O'Connor. I paid good money for you, and I aim to collect what's mine. I was never yours to buy, Grace responded, anger giving strength to her words. Your uncle thought differently. Hollister turned to his companions. The girls up there with that saddled tramp who interfered, spread out and approach from different angles. Preston's expression hardened. Last warning, Hollister, he called. Ride away now, or there'll be consequences. The only consequence here is what happens to men who steal what belongs to me, Hollister shouted back, drawing his pistol. The crack of Preston's rifle split the air. Hollister's horse reared as dust kicked up inches from its front hooves. That was a warning shot, Preston called. The next one won't be. The 2 men with Hollister had already dismounted and were seeking cover among the rocks on either side of the trail. Hollister himself slid from his saddle and crouched behind a boulder. You can't hold out forever, Oaks, Hollister shouted. We've got supplies, ammunition, and all the time in the world. Preston didn't respond, his attention focused on the movements of the hired guns who were attempting to work their way around to flank their position. He fired again, forcing one of the men to retreat to better cover. "They're trying to surround us," he murmured to Grace. "Stay low and keep your eyes on that left side. If you see movement, tell me." Grace nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She gripped the revolver tightly, hoping she wouldn't have to use it but prepared to do so if necessary. For nearly an hour, a tense stalemate ensued. Occasional shots were exchanged, but distance and good cover on both sides prevented any hits. The sun sank lower, shadows lengthening across the rocky terrain. "They'll wait for dark," Preston predicted. "Then try to rush us." Grace swallowed hard. "What do we do?" Preston considered their options. "We need to even the odds before nightfall." With careful movements, he repositioned himself behind a different boulder, one that offered a better angle on the man who had been working his way around to their left. Grace held her breath as Preston took careful aim. The rifle cracked and she heard a cry of pain from the direction of his target. "Got him," Preston said grimly. "Shoulder wound from the sound of it. He won't be doing any more shooting today." A volley of angry shots from Hollister and the remaining gunmen answered Preston's success, bullets whining off the rocks around them. Grace ducked instinctively, though they were well protected by their position. As the echoes of gunfire faded, Hollister's voice carried up to them again. "You've hurt my man, Oaks. For that, I'll see you die slow when I get my hands on you." "Give it up, Hollister," Preston called back. "You've lost one man already. Take him and go before things get worse." "It's almost dark," Hollister responded. "When night falls, we're coming up there to finish this, and when we do, that girl will wish she'd come with me peaceful like from the start." The threat sent a chill through Grace. She looked at Preston, whose expression had turned dangerous. "He means it, doesn't he?" Preston nodded once. "Yes." "But he won't get the chance." He checked the ammunition in his rifle. "I need to end this before dark. Stay here and keep down." Before Grace could protest, Preston had slipped away, moving silently among the rocks until he disappeared from her sight. She clutched the revolver tighter, scanning the approaches for any sign of Hollister or his remaining man. Minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. The sun touched the mountain peaks to the west, bathing the landscape in golden light. Grace strained her ears for any sound that might indicate what was happening. A shot rang out from somewhere below and to her right, followed by another. Then silence. Grace held her breath, her finger hovering near the trigger of the revolver. Footsteps crunched on loose stones nearby. Grace whirled, the gun extended in shaking hands. "It's me," Preston's voice came softly. "It's over." He emerged from between two boulders, a cut on his cheek but otherwise unharmed. Relief flooded through Grace, so intense it made her dizzy. She lowered the revolver. "Hollister." "Won't bother you or anyone else again," Preston said simply. His remaining man surrendered. "I told him to take the wounded one and ride out. Don't think they'll argue." The matter-of-fact way he delivered this news told Grace everything she needed to know. Preston Oaks had killed before and would kill again if necessary to protect what he valued. The realization should have frightened her, but instead she found herself profoundly grateful for his capability. "Thank you," she said, the words wholly inadequate for what he had done. Preston holstered his pistol and took the revolver gently from her hands. "Let's get moving. I'd rather not spend the night here." They gathered their belongings and mounted up, leaving the rocky outcropping behind as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. They rode in silence, both processing the events of the day. Grace found herself studying Preston's profile in the gathering darkness, seeing him with new eyes. This man had risked his life for her not once but twice now. He had killed to protect her from a fate worse than death. In the brutal calculus of the frontier, he had bid his very soul for her freedom. "You're staring," Preston observed without looking at her. Grace didn't look away. "I'm wondering why you've done all this. The truth this time." Preston was quiet for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful. "When I first saw you in that cabin, with your uncle counting Hollister's money and that look in your eyes' defiance, even in despair it reminded me of someone. Your sister," he shook his head. "My mother." My father wasn't always a kind man. After my brother died in a riding accident, he turned cruel. Blamed her, though it wasn't her fault. She endured it for years, keeping that same defiant spark alive. His jaw tightened. She died while I was fighting in the war. Never got to tell her I would have helped her leave if she'd wanted to. The personal confession touched Grace deeply. So helping me is a way of honoring her? Maybe, Preston admitted. Or maybe I'm just tired of seeing good people crushed by those who think might makes right. They rode on through the night, pushing the horses harder than was wise but driven by the need to reach safety. Around midnight, lights appeared in the distance. The town of Silver Creek. The settlement was larger than Grace had expected, with a proper main street lined with buildings. Despite the late hour, the saloon was still lit up, and a few other windows showed lamplight. Preston led them directly to a two-story structure with a sign identifying it as the Silver Creek Hotel. A sleepy-eyed young man answered Preston's knock on the rear door. "Mr. Oaks." "Didn't expect to see you till winter." "Evening, Jim. Need a room for the lady. It's urgent." Jim's eyes widened slightly as he noticed Grace, but he asked no questions. "Mrs. Peterson's asleep, but we've got a room available. Sign the book and I'll show you up." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, washstand, and a chair by the window. Preston set Grace's bag on the floor. "You'll be safe here tonight," he assured her. "I'll get a room down the hall." Grace caught his arm as he turned to leave. "Preston," she said, using his first name for the first time. "Thank you for everything." He covered her hand with his own, the brief contact sending warmth through her tired body. "Get some rest. We'll talk in the morning." After he left, Grace washed the trail dust from her face and hands, then collapsed onto the bed, too exhausted to even undress properly. Despite her fatigue, sleep eluded her as her mind replayed the events of the past days. How quickly life could change from captivity to freedom, from despair to hope, and Preston Oaks. Who was this man who had appeared from nowhere to save her? A drifter with honor, a killer with compassion, a man haunted by his past yet willing to risk everything for a stranger's future. Grace finally drifted to sleep with these thoughts swirling in her mind, and dreamed of wide open spaces and a man with storm-gray eyes. Morning arrived with sunlight streaming through the room's small window and the sounds of a town coming to life. Grace washed and dressed in her cleanest remaining clothes, then made her way downstairs to the hotel's dining room. She found Preston already there, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt, deep in conversation with a plump, pleasant-faced woman who must be Mrs. Peterson. They both looked up as Grace approached. "Ah, here she is now," Mrs. Peterson said warmly. "Miss O'Connor, I'm Helen Peterson. Mr. Oaks has been telling me about your situation." Grace glanced at Preston, wondering exactly what he'd revealed. "Just that you're looking for a fresh start," he assured her, reading her concern, "and that you might be interested in work." Mrs. Peterson nodded enthusiastically. "We're always short-handed, especially with summer travelers coming through. Can you make beds, serve food, and keep a civil tongue with customers?" "Yes, madam," Grace confirmed. "I'm a quick learner and not afraid of hard work." "Then you're hired," Mrs. Peterson declared. "Room and board plus $10 a month, more once you've proven yourself." The offer was more generous than Grace had expected. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson. I'm grateful for the opportunity." "Don't thank me yet," the older woman said with a laugh. "You haven't seen how busy we get when the cattle buyers come through. Now sit down, both of you, and have some breakfast. You look like you've had a rough journey." Over a hearty meal of eggs, bacon, and biscuits, Mrs. Peterson kept up a steady stream of chatter about the town and its inhabitants. Grace learned that Silver Creek had begun as a mining settlement, but had evolved into a trading center for the surrounding ranches as the silver played out. The railroad was rumored to be planning a spur line to the town, which would bring even more prosperity. "Of course we have our share of trouble too," Mrs. Peterson admitted. "Saloon gets rowdy on paydays, and we've had some trouble with cattle rustlers in the area, but Sheriff Hayes keeps things mostly peaceful." When breakfast was finished, Mrs. Peterson showed Grace to a small room at the back of the hotel, the room that would be hers as long as she worked there. It was plain but clean, with a narrow bed, a small chest for her belongings, and a window overlooking the stable yard. "Get settled in," Mrs. Peterson instructed. "You can start work tomorrow. Today, rest and perhaps get yourself some necessities from the general store. Mr. Oaks mentioned you traveled light." When they were alone, Grace turned to Preston. "How much did you tell her?" "Just that you needed work and a safe place," he assured her. "Your story is yours to tell or keep as you see fit," Grace nodded, grateful for his discretion. "What happens now, with us I mean?" Preston glanced out the window, his expression unreadable. "That depends." "On what?" He turned to face her, his eyes serious. "On whether you want me to stay or go." The directness of the question took Grace by surprise. 2 days ago, she had been a captive about to be sold to a man she despised. Now she stood in a room of her own, with work, independence, and a future stretching before her. And this man, this complex, honorable man who had given her this chance, was asking if she wanted him in that future. "I don't want you to leave," Grace admitted, the words coming more easily than she'd expected. "Not yet." Something softened in Preston's gaze. "Then I'll stay, for a while at least." They spent the day exploring Silver Creek together. The town was indeed growing, with a church, school, and several businesses along the main street. The general store provided Grace with essentials she'd been unable to bring from Copper Ridge: a second dress, undergarments, hairpins, and a shawl for cool evenings. As they walked, Grace noticed how people greeted Preston with respect and familiarity. Clearly, his visits to Silver Creek had made an impression. "The blacksmith offered me work," Preston mentioned as they left the smithy's shop. "Said he could use an extra hand with all the business coming through." "Will you take it?" Grace asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Preston shrugged. "Might. It would be a change from drifting." The possibility that he might stay in Silver Creek filled Grace with a warmth she wasn't ready to examine too closely. They had known each other only days, yet she felt connected to this man in a way she couldn't explain. That evening, they dined at the hotel again, sharing a table near the window. As they ate, Preston told her more about his life, his childhood in Kentucky, his service in the war, the restless years that followed as he sought something he couldn't name. "After a while, moving becomes a habit," he confessed. "Staying in one place means facing yourself, your memories. It's easier to keep riding." "Is that what you want?" Grace asked. "To keep moving forever?" Preston studied her face in the lamplight. "I thought it was, now I'm not so sure." The days that followed fell into a pattern. Grace worked at the hotel, quickly proving her worth to Mrs. Peterson through diligence and a cheerful manner with guests. Preston took the blacksmith's offer and demonstrated a natural talent with horses and metalwork. In the evenings, they often walked together through town or sat on the hotel's porch, talking late into the night. A month passed, then two. Summer gave way to autumn, the mountains blazing with color before the first snowfall. Grace's position at the hotel had become secure, with Mrs. Peterson treating her almost like a daughter. Preston, too, had put down tentative roots, renting a small cabin at the edge of town and earning a reputation as one of the best horsemen in the county. Yet neither had spoken of what was growing between them: the lingering glances, the way their hands sometimes touched when they walked, the ease of their conversations that often stretched until midnight. It was as if both feared that naming the feeling might somehow break the fragile peace they had found. On a crisp October evening, Preston invited Grace to dinner at the town's only restaurant a step up from the hotel dining room, with tablecloths and a menu that ventured beyond frontier basics. Grace wore her new dress, a deep green that matched her eyes, her auburn hair arranged more carefully than usual. "You look beautiful," Preston said simply when she met him outside the hotel. The compliment brought warmth to her cheeks. "Thank you, you look quite handsome yourself." He did indeed. His usual trail clothes had been replaced by a proper suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. He offered his arm with a formality that made her smile, and they walked to the restaurant together. Over dinner, their conversation flowed as easily as always, but Grace sensed something different in Preston's manner: attention, an expectation. When dessert was finished and coffee served, he reached across the table to take her hand. Grace, he began, his voice low. These past months have been the happiest I can remember. Her heart quickened at his words. For me too. I've been thinking about the future, Preston continued, about staying in Silver Creek permanently. I hoped you might, Grace admitted. His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, the gentle touch sending shivers up her arm. The thing is, I don't want to stay just for the work or the town or even the friends I've made here. His eyes held hers. I want to stay for you. The directness of his declaration took her breath away. Preston, I know it hasn't been that long, he hurried on, and you may think it's too soon, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. He squeezed her hand gently. I love you, Grace O'Connor. I think I started falling for you that first day when you stood in your uncle's cabin with your head held high despite everything. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. I love you too, she whispered, the truth of it resonating through her entire being. I've been afraid to say it, afraid you might still want to leave someday. Relief and happiness transformed Preston's face. Not a chance, my wandering days are over. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box, which brings me to a question I've been wanting to ask. Grace's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring with a small pearl set in the center. Grace O'Connor, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? The moment stretched between them, perfect in its simplicity. This man had saved her from a fate worse than death, had protected her, respected her choices, and given her time to find herself again. In doing so, he had healed something in his own heart as well. Yes, she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. Yes, I will marry you, Preston Oaks. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then raised her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. Around them, the restaurant had gone quiet as other diners realized what was happening. When Preston leaned across the table to kiss her properly, a cheer went up from the other patrons. Grace laughed, blushing at the attention but too happy to care. It seems we have the town's approval. Mrs. Peterson will be insufferably pleased with herself, Preston noted with a grin. She's been hinting about this for weeks. They left the restaurant to find that word had somehow already spread. People called congratulations as they walked back to the hotel, where Mrs. Peterson was waiting with tears in her eyes and a bottle of her best whiskey to celebrate. The wedding took place 2 weeks later in Silver Creek's small church. The entire town turned out for the occasion, filling the pews and spilling out onto the steps. Grace wore a cream-colored dress that Mrs. Peterson and the other hotel staff had helped her make, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Preston stood tall in a new suit, his eyes never leaving Grace as she walked down the aisle on the arm of Sheriff Hayes, who had offered to give her away. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promising love and faithfulness through whatever life might bring. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Preston kissed her with such tenderness that Grace felt her heart might overflow. The celebration afterward lasted well into the night, with food contributed by every household in town and music provided by a fiddler from one of the nearby ranches. Grace and Preston danced under lantern light, surrounded by people who had become their community. Late in the evening, they slipped away to the cabin Preston had prepared for them, no longer a bachelor's sparse dwelling but a home, with curtains at the windows and a quilt on the bed that the town's women had made as a wedding gift. As Preston carried her across the threshold, Grace wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered, "From captivity to this, I still can't quite believe it." He set her gently on her feet, his hands remaining at her waist. "Believe it. You're free and you're loved, and nothing will ever change that." "My knight in dusty armor," she said softly, reaching up to touch his face. "You bid your soul for me that day in Copper Ridge." Preston shook his head, drawing her closer. "Not my soul, my heart, and it was the best trade I ever made." Their life together in Silver Creek unfolded with the passing seasons. Preston's work with the blacksmith expanded to include horse training, his natural gifts making him sought after by ranchers throughout the territory. Grace continued at the hotel until the following spring, when she discovered she was expecting their first child. Their daughter, Sarah, was born on a snowy December night in 1877, with Mrs. Peterson serving as midwife. Preston paced outside their bedroom until the first cry announced the baby's arrival, then fell instantly in love with the tiny girl with Grace's green eyes and his dark hair. 2 years later, their son Michael joined the family, followed by another daughter, Elizabeth, in 1881. Their cabin expanded with their growing family, with Preston adding rooms and a proper porch where the children could play under Grace's watchful eye. The railroad did indeed come to Silver Creek in 1882, bringing more growth and prosperity. Preston and Grace invested in land on the edge of town, building a proper horse farm where Preston could pursue his father's legacy of breeding and training quality mounts. On warm summer evenings, they would often sit together on their porch, watching their children play in the yard and the sunset painting the distant mountains with gold. On one such evening, nearly 10 years after they had first met, Grace leaned her head against Preston's shoulder and sighed contentedly. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "How different life might have been," she admitted. "If you hadn't walked into my uncle's cabin that day," Preston's arm tightened around her. "I don't like to think about that." "Nor do I," Grace agreed, "but it makes me all the more grateful for what we have." She turned to look at him, at the face she had come to know as well as her own. The years had added a few lines around his eyes and a touch of silver at his temples, but to her, he was more handsome than ever. "Do you ever miss it, the freedom of drifting?" Preston watched their children, Sarah teaching Michael how to twirl a rope, little Elizabeth toddling after them on chubby legs, and shook his head. "Not for a moment. This is the only freedom that matters." Grace smiled, knowing it was true. They had both found liberation, she from captivity, he from restlessness in the love they shared and the life they had built together. In the years that followed, their story became something of a legend in Silver Creek. How Preston Oaks had bid his very soul at an auction where a greedy man sold his niece to the highest bidder. How he had carried her away to safety, fought for her freedom, and eventually won her heart. What few knew was how close it had all come to ending differently. How a chance encounter, a moment of courage, and a willingness to risk everything had changed the course of 2 lives forever. On their 20th anniversary, as they danced under the stars at a celebration thrown by their now grown children, Preston whispered in Grace's ear, "Still the best bid I ever made." Grace laughed and pressed closer to him, her heart as full as it had been on their wedding day. "And I'm still the luckiest woman in the West." They continued their dance as the music played on, 2 souls who had found in each other not just love, but redemption, purpose, and the truest freedom of all, the freedom to belong completely to another heart.